Pick up a dollar bill, any dollar bill from your wallet. Look at it closely. You will see the words Federal Reserve Note printed across the top. You will see the green ink, the intricate patterns, the face of George Washington staring back at you with that stern, unchanging expression. It looks official. It looks permanent. It looks like money. But what you are actually holding is a piece of paper whose value rests on a secret agreement made in a desert over 50 years ago. An agreement signed not in a grand marble hall in Washington, but in a private palace in Saudi Arabia. An agreement that was never put to a vote, never debated in Congress, never disclosed to the American people. An agreement that effectively turned the entire global economy into a machine designed to extract wealth from every human being on Earth and funnel it toward a single country. Most people believe the US dollar is valuable because America has the strongest economy, or because it is backed by gold sitting in vaults at Fort Knox, or because of some vague notion of American power and prestige. They are wrong. The dollar has value for one reason and one reason only. Because if you want to buy oil, the most essential commodity in the modern world, you must first buy dollars. And that requirement, that invisible tax on every liter of gasoline and every barrel of crude oil traded anywhere on the planet, was not an accident of history. It was engineered, deliberately, secretly, in 1974. This is the story of the petrodollar. The story of how the United States, facing total economic collapse, sent a man to the Saudi desert to make a deal that would save the American empire and enslave the rest of the world. It is a story about the weaponization of currency, the conversion of energy into geopolitical control, and the construction of a financial architecture so powerful and so invisible that even now most people do not realize they are living inside it. And it is also the story of how that system, after half a century of dominance, is beginning to crack. To understand the secret deal, you have to understand the crisis that made it necessary. The crisis that nearly destroyed the United States in 1971. For nearly 3 decades after World War II, the global financial system operated under an agreement called Bretton Woods, negotiated in a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944. The rules were simple and elegant. The US dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other major currency was pegged to the dollar. If you were a foreign government holding US dollars, you could walk into the US Treasury and exchange those dollars for physical gold bars at any time. No questions asked. This made the dollar as good as gold. Better than gold, actually, because you could use it to buy things while gold just sat in a vault. The system worked brilliantly for the United States. Dollars flooded the world as the global reserve currency. American goods were purchased everywhere. American influence expanded. The dollar was king, backed by the largest gold hoard in history, held at Fort Knox and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But by the late 1960s, cracks were forming. The United States was spending far beyond its means. The Vietnam War was consuming billions of dollars every month. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, Social Security expansion, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare were adding billions more to the federal budget. The government was printing money to pay for it all. Lots of money. More money than they had gold to back it up. Other countries noticed. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, was the first to call America's bluff. De Gaulle did not trust the United States. He believed the Americans were abusing their privileged position at the center of the financial system, printing paper and exchanging it for real goods from other nations while the gold reserves that supposedly backed that paper were quietly disappearing. So in 1965, de Gaulle began converting France's dollar reserves into gold. He sent the dollars to New York and demanded the gold be shipped to Paris. Other nations followed. Germany, Switzerland. The gold was flowing out of Fort Knox faster than the US government could replenish it. By 1971, President Richard Nixon was staring at a nightmare scenario. Foreign governments held more dollars than the United States had gold to redeem them. If every country demanded gold at once, the US would default. The entire Bretton Woods system would collapse. The dollar would become worthless. America, the superpower that had won World War II and rebuilt Europe and contained the Soviet Union, was about to go bankrupt. On the evening of August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon appeared on national television. He announced, in language carefully designed to obscure what was actually happening, that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That was the word he used. It has now been over 50 years. The suspension is permanent. Overnight, the dollar became a fiat currency. It was backed by nothing. No gold, no silver, no physical commodity of any kind. Just a promise. A promise from a government that had just broken its previous promise. The results were immediate and catastrophic. The value of the dollar collapsed. Inflation exploded. The price of oil quadrupled. The American economy entered a decade-long nightmare of stagnation and rising prices that economists would later call stagflation, a term that was invented because what was happening was not supposed to be possible according to the economic theories of the time. If nothing changed, the dollar would die. And if the dollar died, American power died with it. The United States would no longer be able to finance its military, its global network of bases, its alliances, its empire. The government needed a solution. They needed a way to make the rest of the world want dollars, even though those dollars were no longer backed by gold. They needed to tie the dollar to something every country on Earth needed. Something more important than gold. Something that powered every car, every factory, every airplane, every military machine on the planet. They needed oil. In October 1973, the world was plunged into chaos. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Israel was caught off guard and came dangerously close to defeat. The United States, under Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, airlifted massive quantities of weapons and supplies to Israel, turning the tide of the war. The Arab nations were furious. On October 17, 1973, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, announced an oil embargo against the United States and other nations that supported Israel. Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter in the world, cut production by 5 million barrels per day. Other nations followed. The global oil supply dropped by 25% almost overnight. The price of oil quadrupled from $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel. In the United States, panic set in. Gas stations ran out of fuel. Cars lined up for miles waiting to fill their tanks. The government imposed rationing. People could only buy gas on certain days depending on whether their license plate ended in an odd or even number. Factories shut down because they could not get fuel. The economy, already weakened by the collapse of Bretton Woods, was now facing total paralysis. But Henry Kissinger, a German-born Jewish refugee who had escaped the Nazis and risen to become the most powerful diplomat in the world, saw something else. He saw an opportunity. If the United States could not control the gold supply anymore, maybe it could control the oil supply. Or more precisely, control the flow of money from oil. If the US could ensure that oil, the commodity every nation needed, was priced exclusively in dollars, then the demand for dollars would be permanent. The dollar would be backed not by gold, but by black gold, by energy itself. In 1974, after the embargo ended, Kissinger and a small team of advisors made a secret trip to Saudi Arabia. They met with King Faisal and senior members of the House of Saud, the royal family that had ruled the Desert Kingdom since its founding in 1932. The details of those meetings have never been fully disclosed. There are no transcripts, no recordings, no minutes. But we know what was agreed to because we can see the results. Kissinger made the Saudis an offer they could not refuse. Saudi Arabia at the time was a developing nation sitting on top of the world's largest oil reserves. But they were surrounded by enemies. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence in the Middle East. Radical Arab nationalist movements threatened monarchies across the region. Iran, just across the Persian Gulf, was ruled by the Shah, but everyone knew that regime was fragile. The Saudis were terrified. They needed protection. Kissinger offered them absolute security. The United States would provide Saudi Arabia with the most advanced weapons in the world. F-15 fighter jets, missiles, tanks. The U.S. military would train the Saudi armed forces. American bases would guarantee that no enemy could threaten the kingdom. And most importantly, the United States promised that as long as America existed, the House of Saud would rule. It was a promise of eternal protection, a guarantee that the royal family would never be overthrown, never face the fate of the Shah of Iran or the kings of Iraq and Libya who had been toppled by revolutions. In exchange, Saudi Arabia had to agree to two conditions. First, all Saudi oil exports would be priced exclusively in US dollars. No other currency would be accepted. If Japan wanted to buy Saudi oil, they had to pay in dollars. If Germany wanted oil dollars, If France, Brazil, India, anyone wanted to buy oil from the kingdom that controlled a quarter of the world's reserves, they first had to acquire US dollars. Second, Saudi Arabia would take the enormous profits from oil sales and invest them back into the United States. They would buy US Treasury bonds, effectively lending the money back to the US government. The Saudis would become one of the largest creditors to the United States, funding American budget deficits with their oil wealth. By 1975, the rest of OPEC followed Saudi Arabia's lead. The entire global oil market was now priced in dollars. The petrodollar system was born. And with it, the United States had accomplished something extraordinary. They had replaced the gold standard with an oil standard. And unlike gold, which just sits in vaults, oil is consumed. Every day, by everyone. The demand never stops. Think about what this meant. Every country in the world needs oil. Oil powers transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, electricity generation, military operations. Modern civilization runs on oil. Because oil was now priced exclusively in dollars, every country was forced to hold large reserves of US currency. If you were Japan and you needed to import 10 million barrels of oil per day, you first had to earn dollars by selling cars and electronics to other countries. Those dollars would sit in your central bank as reserves, waiting to be spent on energy. This created a permanent, artificial, structural demand for US dollars that had nothing to do with the strength of the American economy. It did not matter if the US was running massive budget deficits. It did not matter if American productivity was declining. As long as the world needed oil, the world needed dollars. And the United States, as the issuer of dollars, could print as much money as it wanted without facing the consequences that would destroy any other nation. When a country like Argentina or Turkey prints too much money, they get hyperinflation. Their currency collapses. But when the United States prints trillions of dollars, that inflation is exported to the rest of the world. Every country holding dollar reserves sees the value of those reserves slowly eroded. Every country buying oil in dollars pays a hidden tax to the United States. The petrodollar system turned the US Federal Reserve into a global central bank with the power to tax every human being on Earth who uses energy. This is why the United States has been able to run trillion-dollar deficits year after year without collapsing. This is why the US can have a national debt exceeding $30 trillion and still borrow money at low interest rates. This is why Americans enjoy a standard of living far beyond what the domestic economy actually produces. The rest of the world is subsidizing it, forced to hold and use a currency that the US can print at will. But the power of the petrodollar goes beyond economics. It became a weapon. If the United States wanted to punish a country, it could cut that country off from the dollar financial system. If you cannot access dollars, you cannot buy oil. If you cannot buy oil, your economy dies. This gave Washington the ability to wage economic warfare without firing a shot. Sanctions, embargoes, freezing of assets, all of these tools rely on dollar dominance. The petrodollar turned the global financial system into an enforcement mechanism for American foreign policy. Look at the countries that have been targeted. Iran, cut off from dollar-based oil markets, their economy strangled. Venezuela, unable to sell oil for dollars, facing economic collapse. North Korea, isolated from the global financial system, impoverished. Russia, hit with sanctions that froze dollar reserves and restricted access to dollar transactions. The pattern is clear. If you defy Washington, you lose access to dollars. And without dollars, you lose access to the global economy. This is the invisible empire, no colonial governors, no occupying armies. Just a currency system that every nation is forced to use, and a single country with the power to shut you out of that system if you do not obey. It is colonization through financial architecture. And it has been far more effective than any military conquest in history. For 50 years, this system has endured. It has funded the largest military in human history. It has allowed the United States to consume far more than it produces, running trade deficits year after year while other nations lend America the money to buy their goods. It has been, from the American perspective, the ultimate free lunch. But every system built on coercion eventually faces resistance, and the petrodollar is now under siege. The cracks began to show in the 21st century. The first sign was the rise of domestic oil production in the United States. The fracking revolution, the extraction of oil from shale rock using new drilling technologies, transformed America from the world's largest oil importer into one of the largest oil producers. By 2020, the United States was energy independent. It no longer needed Saudi oil. This changed the fundamental equation of the 1974 deal. When the US was desperately dependent on Saudi oil, protecting Saudi Arabia was a strategic necessity. But when America no longer needed that oil, the alliance became more about geopolitics than economics, and the Saudis noticed. They watched as the United States negotiated with Iran, their mortal enemy. They watched as American politicians criticized the Saudi government for human rights abuses. They watched as U.S. attention shifted to Asia and the competition with China. The royal family in Riyadh began to feel that the American security umbrella was no longer guaranteed. At the same time, a new player entered the game: China. By 2020, China had become the world's largest importer of oil, surpassing the United States. Chinese factories, Chinese cars, Chinese economic growth, all of it runs on oil imported from the Middle East, and for decades, China, like everyone else, was forced to pay for that oil in US dollars. They had to earn dollars by selling goods to America and then use those dollars to buy energy. It was a system that gave the United States enormous leverage over China. But China is no longer willing to accept that arrangement. For years, Chinese officials have been quietly negotiating with Saudi Arabia about the possibility of paying for oil in yuan, the Chinese currency, instead of dollars. If Saudi Arabia agrees, the entire petrodollar system collapses. Because once the largest oil exporter accepts payment in yuan, every other oil producer will follow. The artificial demand for dollars will evaporate. And there are signs that the Saudis are preparing to make that move. In 2022, Saudi Arabia joined the BRICS economic bloc: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, a coalition of nations explicitly trying to reduce dependence on the US dollar. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has met repeatedly with Chinese President Xi Jinping, discussing deeper economic ties and strategic cooperation. The Saudis are playing both sides now, taking American weapons while courting Chinese investment. Why would Saudi Arabia betray the deal that has protected them for 50 years? Because the world is changing, and the Saudis are positioning themselves for a future where American power is no longer absolute. They watched what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In the year 2000, Saddam announced that Iraq would no longer sell oil for dollars. He demanded payment in euros. 3 years later, the United States invaded Iraq, toppled Saddam's government, and one of the first actions of the new Iraqi administration was to switch oil sales back to dollars. They watched what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi was planning to create a gold-backed African currency to challenge the dollar and the euro. He wanted to unite African and Arab oil producers under a new monetary system that would bypass Western control. In 2011, NATO intervened in the Libyan civil war. Gaddafi was killed. His plan died with him. The lesson is clear. Any leader who seriously threatens the petrodollar ends up destroyed. But the Saudis are different. They are too important, too wealthy, too strategically positioned to be toppled by force. They know this. And they are using that leverage to extract concessions from Washington while simultaneously preparing for a post-dollar world. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is preparing as well. Central banks around the globe are buying gold at record levels, the highest in decades. They are building currency swap agreements that allow them to trade with each other without using dollars. Russia and China have been conducting bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. India is buying Russian oil in rupees. The process of dedollarization, once dismissed as impossible, is now undeniably underway. The trigger event was the freezing of Russian dollar reserves after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. When the United States and European Union froze $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, every government on earth took notice. The message was clear. If you cross Washington, your savings can be confiscated with the stroke of a pen. This terrified countries that had spent decades accumulating dollar reserves as a safety net. If those reserves can be seized arbitrarily, they are not safe. They are hostages. This accelerated the move away from the dollar. Nations realized that holding dollars is not just an economic decision, it is a political vulnerability. And so they are diversifying. They are holding more gold, more euros, more yuan, anything to reduce their dependence on a currency that can be weaponized against them. If the petrodollar collapses, the consequences for the United States will be severe and immediate. The artificial demand for dollars that has propped up American living standards for 50 years will disappear. Foreign central banks will start selling their treasury bonds, flooding the market with dollars. The value of the currency will plummet. Inflation will explode. Not the moderate inflation of recent years, but the kind of hyperinflation that destroys savings and sparks social chaos. The federal government will lose the ability to borrow cheaply. Interest rates on the national debt will skyrocket. The government will face a choice: default on the debt, which would destroy the credibility of US bonds forever, or print even more money to pay the interest, which would accelerate inflation into a death spiral. Either way, the era of deficit spending is over. Imported goods, which Americans have grown accustomed to buying cheaply, will become unaffordable. Electronics from China, cars from Japan and Germany, clothes from Southeast Asia, food from Latin America. All of it will cost multiples of what it costs today because the dollar will no longer have the purchasing power it once had. The standard of living for the average American will decline sharply and suddenly. This is not speculation. This is what happens when a reserve currency loses its status. It happened to the British pound in the mid-20th century when the pound was replaced by the dollar as the global reserve. Britain went from ruling an empire to facing austerity and economic decline. The same fate awaits any nation that loses reserve currency status. And the United States, with its enormous debt and dependence on foreign borrowing, is more vulnerable than any reserve currency nation in history. The elites know this. The Pentagon knows this. The Federal Reserve knows this. This is why American foreign policy in the Middle East has been so aggressive for the past 50 years. Every war, every intervention, every coup has been about protecting the petrodollar. It is not about democracy or human rights or terrorism. It is about ensuring that oil remains priced in dollars. Because the day that ends is the day the American empire ends. We are living in the twilight of the petrodollar system. The secret deal made in the Saudi desert in 1974 gave the United States 50 years of unparalleled power and prosperity. It allowed America to live beyond its means, to wage wars without economic consequences, to dominate global finance without holding gold or producing goods. It was the greatest geopolitical coup in modern history, but it was also a Faustian bargain. The system enriched America but impoverished much of the world. Developing nations were trapped in dollar-denominated debt, forced to export their resources to earn the currency they needed to buy energy. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, institutions controlled by the United States, imposed austerity and structural adjustment on countries that could not repay their dollar debts. Entire continents were hollowed out to feed the dollar machine, and now the machine is breaking down. The world is moving slowly but inexorably toward a multipolar currency system. The dollar will not disappear overnight, but its dominance is ending. China, Russia, India, the Gulf states, all of them are preparing for a world where the dollar is one currency among many, not the only one that matters. The American public is largely unaware of this. They do not understand that their prosperity is built on a monetary system created by a secret deal. They do not know that the cheap goods, the low interest rates, the endless government spending, all of it is subsidized by the rest of the world's need for dollars. And when that need disappears, so does the subsidy. The petrodollar was a masterpiece of financial engineering and geopolitical strategy. It saved the United States from collapse in the 1970s. It built an empire without colonies, but every empire falls. And this one is falling not through military defeat, but through the slow, grinding logic of economic reality. You cannot print prosperity forever. You cannot force the world to use your currency forever. And you cannot break promises forever without consequences. The gold is gone. The oil monopoly is ending. The secret deal is unraveling. What comes next is a return to a world where value must be earned, not printed. Where nations must produce, not just consume. Where power is shared, not monopolized. It will be painful for those who benefited from the old system, but it will be a reckoning long overdue. The dollar bill in your hand is not worthless yet, but it is worth far less than you think. And every day, as the world moves away from the petrodollar, it is worth a little bit less. The empire built on oil and paper is crumbling. The only question is how fast and how chaotic the collapse will be.